If you close your eyes.
You will find pivot tables and graphs to be very helpful when you're doing analyses and observing trends. But once you have insights that you want to share with your colleagues, how do you transfer your findings into a visual to share? You will also use pivot tables and graphs for sharing, but you will need to focus more on the formatting and the look of your exhibits to ensure that they're well received. Pay special attention to the content of this section because once you've conquered the technical skills from earlier in the course, it will be crucial that you can create easy-to-understand visuals. When creating exhibits to share with an audience, whether it's just your boss or your entire department, you'll want to ask yourself two questions first. What conclusions do I want my audience to walk away with? And what questions from my audience can I anticipate? Asking yourself these questions before you start creating your exhibits will not only enable you to create well-received exhibits, but will minimize the time you spend changing and editing the exhibits in the long run. Whenever you're presenting an observation or insight, it's important to know ahead of time what conclusions you want your audience to draw. Strategically place circles to call out specific areas of your exhibit, and colored font will help draw your audience's attention to where you want them to focus. If you can also anticipate what questions your audience will ask, then you can tailor your exhibits to answer these questions without you having to address them during your presentation, and you will be better prepared. Let's use our average loss graph as an example. Right now, we have a simple line graph showing average loss. If I think about what conclusions I want my audience to draw, it's that average loss has been increasing over the past couple years. While the line looks a little jumpy, if I add a trend line by right-clicking on the line and selecting Add Trend Line, we can see that there is a clear upward trend. By adding the trend line, I make this very apparent to my audience. Next, I'll ask myself, what questions can I anticipate my audience having? Since the two fields used to calculate average loss are losses and claim count, I think my audience will be curious about how those two individual fields are behaving during the same time period shown on the graph. Since we have this information already, I can now think about adding them into the exhibit. Now, both of these fields have very different ranges from average loss and from each other, which won't have a nice appearance on the graph. Losses are in the millions, claim count in the hundreds, and average loss in the thousands. So since we only have two axes to work with, one of these fields will end up getting flattened on the graph. Because of this, I'm only going to add one of the fields. I'll choose claim count and I'll put it on the secondary axis. Now I notice that having these two lines on the graph looks confusing and busy, so I'm going to decide to change the claim count graph type. I'll do this by right-clicking on the line and selecting Change Series Chart Type, which will allow me to select from the Charts ribbon. Changing claim count to a column graph completely changes the look and feel of the graph and makes it easier to understand and draw conclusions from because claim count and average loss are still on the same horizontal axis, but they're separated so trends are more apparent. I also want to keep the formatting in mind. The first thing I want to do is add a title above the graph. This will make it immediately obvious to my audience what my exhibit is about. I'll do this by going to the Design ribbon under Chart Tools and going to Add Chart Element. I'll click on Chart Title and select Above Chart. Now that I've labeled the graph, it will be immediately clear to my audience that we are going to talk about the monthly average loss trend. Since the claim count column graph is running below and above the average loss line, I'm going to adjust the secondary axis. I'll do this by right-clicking on the axis and selecting Format Axis. I'm going to make the maximum a bit higher so that it will flatten out the claim count just a bit to keep all the claim count graph underneath the monthly average loss graph. Now that I've set the maximum of the graph to 2200, the trend of claim count is still very clear, but the graph looks cleaner because the claim count bar graph doesn't run into the average loss line graph. It also appears that the markers on the average loss line are making the graph a little busy. So I will remove these by right-clicking on the line and selecting Format Data Series. Now that I'm in the Marker section of Format Data Series, I'll click on Marker Options and select None. This creates a much cleaner looking graph. The last change I want to make to the graph is to add a legend. This way, the audience will know what each graph represents. I'll go to Add Chart Element and select Legend at the bottom. This now shows that the red columns are claim count, the solid blue line is average loss, and the dotted blue line is the linear trend line for average loss. With these changes, we've created a graph that is visually appealing and will be easy to understand by our audience. But if you close your eyes.
But if you close your eyes